huge problem. My friend here was talking about rights, that the government is really good at extending rights. No, no, no. Government is really good at restricting rights. And then when we take away the government restriction of rights, when we forbid them to use force in certain areas, suddenly they claim that they've expanded rights. I mean, who enforced slavery? The government enforced slavery. You couldn't have slavery if you had to go and catch your slaves yourself. Well, they just run off. And what are you going to do? No, you have slavery because the government will go and catch them for you and bring them back. It is the government that enforces slavery. Who didn't enforce the rights of contracts for women? It was the government. Government didn't do that. And you can sort of go on and on. I mean, in Canada, the government says it's perfectly fine to hit your children if they're between 2 years and 12 years of age. You see, 12 years in 1 day. It's wrong. 1 day short of 2 years, it's wrong. Next day, it's right. I mean, it's crazy, right? I mean, so it is the government that is failing to protect this. This is not something that the government solves. This is a problem the government creates, and the degree to which we restrict and control and minimize the power of the state is the degree to which we get equality in society. And so, I agree that poverty is a big problem. Then the biggest governments should have the least poverty and the greatest equality, but we see over and over again, as government power grows, inequality grows, the middle class gets hollowed out. You get this polarization. The rich use the power of the state to line their own pockets. They use the legal protections of one of the greatest evils called corporatism, called corporations. Corporations are huge legal shields that the rich hide behind to escape the consequences of their actions. Remember that BP oil spill? How many BP executives lost their homes because they weren't taking care of their rigs? How many bankers went to jail for destroying trillions of dollars of the world's wealth? 0. How many protesters went to jail in the United States for singing Van Morrison in a public park? 2,500. The power of the state enriches the rich, impoverishes the poor. We were just driving around, and we were talking about this yesterday when we went walking around Sao Paulo. I know that the average Brazilian wage is $6,000, $7,000, maybe a little more US dollars per year. And so naturally we thought, well, you know, if the labor costs are so low here, we should go and buy a lot of stuff. You know, we should be, you know, rich, evil, gringo capitalists come in and buy a bunch of stuff, which would bid up wages, which would increase everybody's income over the long run. We went to the mall. I looked at a nice pair of slingback pumps. No. But we looked at shoes, and they were more expensive than Canada. We looked at the electronics. It's like, well, not too bad. The tax is what? 100% on an iPad. And so we can't. And is that because the government is doing something to help the poor? No. The government is not helping the poor because the government is not letting us purchase stuff, thus driving up the wages of the poor. The only way to raise the wages of the poor, not pass laws and point guns at people who won't hire them for more, raise the demand for the poor, which means lowering barriers to trade. Lowering barriers to trade always drives up. This is a sustainable way to increase the wealth of society. Passing laws, pointing guns at you and giving the money to you, I mean, it just completely distorts everything. Completely distorts everything. So my argument is, when you take the gun out of the room, human society, human interactions, human relationships, human economics always improve. Not necessarily for everyone all the time, of course not, right? But in general, that is the very, very clear trend. As government powers go down, the human condition improves. As government power increases, the human condition decreases. I mean, to do all of this stuff, to do all of the social engineering, the welfare state and this and that, the government has to do two things which are unbelievably bad for people. Number one, it has to take control of the money supply, right? Because to give people things, if you don't control the money supply, if you have a gold standard, or whatever it is that maintains the value of currency, because I know in South America, the value of currency can be quite an exciting thing, as it is now for the rest of the world. If you want to give people things for free, you've got to take control of the money supply, because it doesn't work otherwise, right? So if I say, well, I want to give everyone $100, 100 reals, what do I have to do? I got to tax them about 200 reals, because I got to pay my people who move all this money around. I got to pay the tax collectors. I got to pay the people who make sure nobody's cheating. I got to make sure nobody's dead and trying to collect. Or I got to, you know, I got to have the bureaucrats who are going to process the checks. And so I have to tax you. And how many politicians would say this? Aha! I'm going to pay you 100 reals and tax you 200 reals. Vote for me. I mean, this would not be anybody. So in order to give people the 100 reals, you have to take control of the money supply so you can print the money. And the people say, hey, look, I have 100 reals, how fantastic. But it only buys 20 or 30 or 40 reals worth of stuff because it's all so much. And then, of course, when they control the money supply, they have to control the interest rates. Because if you print all this money, the interest rates go up. And all the money that you've borrowed to bribe all these people, interest rate goes up. And then the taxes have to go way up. And then everybody realizes what a game. Right? The Europeans are figuring this out. Fiat currencies last about 30 or 40 years, and the US went fiat in 1971, and it was in the 70s and 80s, and it's about 30, 40 years that it lasts, and the euro is, it's all, when you study history, it's all around it, right? Same thing over and over again. Everybody's just surprised who haven't read about the past. So the increased government power and inflation is the worst thing for the poor. Because the rich can do defensive things with their money, but when the poor are poor and the price of bread is going up, this is unbelievably catastrophic. So this idea that you can appoint some group, and the last thing I'll say is if we are interested in equality, there is no greater inequality between those who control the money supply, who control the interest rates, who can sell off the unborn productivity of future generations for the sake of bribing people in the here and now. And this is inevitable with the state. This is not the state gone wrong. This is the state. You bribe people to get their votes, and you pay them off by selling off fetuses to Chinese bankers. It is unholy. And this is all over the world. There is no exception to this, particularly in democracies. And it's repetitive from the Roman Empire down to the present. You give people shallow entertainments, reality TV, Telemundo. You give them this stuff, and you bribe them with printed money and borrowed money. And the power to do that is the greatest inequality. I cannot type whatever I want into my bank account. I've tried. It's a read-only field. Total bummer. But the government can do that. There's no greater power than the power to control money, the power to control interest rates, and the power to sell off the productivity of the unborn. And there is no equality that can come out of that moral and legal and philosophical inequality within society.